The first sensation is pressure. Not the harsh pressure of a blow, but the soft, insistent weight of the world. It is the feel of fine cambric linen wrapped tightly around your limbs, binding your arms to your sides, your legs together. It is a state you have never not known. The second sensation is sound, or rather the lack of it. The world exists as a low, continuous hum, a muffled tapestry of distant echoes that never resolve into distinct noises. Footsteps are softened by thick carpets, voices are distant murmurs behind heavy oak doors. Light is the third sensation, a dim, milky quality that filters through layers of brocade curtain, painting shifting lozenges on the carved ceiling high above, but never truly illuminating your world. You perceive warmth from a nearby fire, the scent of beeswax and dried lavender, the smooth, cool wood of the cradle against your head. These are the fixed points of your universe. Sometimes, hands lift you. They are efficient, practiced, and detached. They change your linens, they administer lukewarm milk from a silver spoon, they hold you. But the holding is a passive act, a simple transfer of weight. It is the way one might hold a porcelain vase with care, but without conversation. You are an object in a quiet, opulent room, a secret kept in a velvet box. In the late autumn of a year in the mid-17th century, within a royal palace humming with the constant activity of a major European court, a birth took place. This was not, however, an event of state. There were no cannons prepared for a celebratory salute, no courtiers gathered in antechambers awaiting the news of a new prince or princess. The birth occurred in a remote suite of rooms in a disused wing of the palace, quarters typically reserved for visiting minor dignitaries. The corridors outside patrolled by guards whose orders were simply to ensure no one approached. The event was attended by only 3 individuals in addition to the royal mother. The court's most senior physician, a midwife of immense discretion sought from a distant province, and a single, high-ranking lady-in-waiting, the Queen's childhood confidant. The silence surrounding the delivery was the first indicator of its nature. A royal birth was a public performance, a demonstration of dynastic continuity. This was a clandestine medical procedure, surviving correspondence from the physician, written to his brother a month later and employing heavy-coded language, refers to a difficult and delicate matter of household health that required his utmost prudence. The labor was long, the atmosphere fraught not with the joyful anticipation of a new heir, but with the clinical tension of managing a crisis. When the infant finally emerged, the expected cry was followed not by exclamations of relief, but by a profound and sudden quiet. In that quiet, the assessment was made. The physician, a man trained in the humoral theories of Galen but also a keen observer, noted the anomalies immediately. His private journals, which were not discovered until 2 centuries later, document his findings with dispassionate precision. He observed what he termed a tartar-like cast to the eyes, set in a noticeably flattened facial profile. He recorded an unusual laxity of the limbs and a general lack of muscular tone, causing the infant to feel like a doll of rags. Most peculiar to his 17th century medical mind was the single, deep, transverse crease that ran across the infant's palms, a detail he sketched in the margins of his notes, labeling it simply lineus ingularis. He also noted a small mouth and a protruding tongue, a detail that concerned him for its potential impact on feeding. These physical markers were not understood in a genetic context. They were interpreted through the prevailing superstitions and theological frameworks of the era. They were stigmata, signs. To the physician they pointed to a humoral imbalance originating in the womb, a cold and moist constitution that had failed to properly form the vessel of the body. To the midwife and the lady-in-waiting, products of a deeply religious culture, the interpretation was more sinister. Such a birth could be seen as a sign of divine displeasure, a punishment for some hidden sin of the parents or the kingdom. Or, in a more folkloric sense, it could be a changeling, a malformed creature left by fairies. The word imbecile was whispered. The term monster, a common descriptor for any significant congenital abnormality, was carefully avoided but hung in the air. The news was conveyed to the king not by a jubilant courtier, but by the physician himself in the monarch's private study. The report was not of a son or daughter, but of a complication. The infant was described as weakly, ill-formed, and unlikely to thrive. The visible differences were detailed not as unique traits, but as defects that made public acknowledgement impossible. The child was, from the first hour of its existence, a dynastic liability. The immediate command from the sovereign was absolute silence. An official story was to be prepared and disseminated. The queen had delivered a stillborn child, a tragedy that would plunge the court into a period of formal mourning. This official narrative served two purposes. It explained the queen's seclusion and it preemptively answered any questions about a new heir. The living infant, meanwhile, became an unperson. Before the mother had even fully recovered, the child was swaddled, removed from the birthing suite, and carried through service corridors to a prepared nursery in another, even more isolated, section of the palace. Its existence had commenced as a state secret. The infant, now installed in its designated suite, existed in a state of administrative limbo. For any child, a name is the first and most fundamental anchor of identity. For a royal child, it is an instrument of state. A name like Charles, Louis, or Philip is not merely a label, it is a declaration of lineage, a claim on history, a link in the great chain of dynastic succession. The selection of a name was a political act, weighed for its historical resonance and its diplomatic implications. It was the word that would be stamped on treaties, proclaimed at coronations, and carved onto tombs. Therefore, the most critical act in the formal erasure of this particular child was the deliberate and total withholding of a name. It was not forgotten, it was denied. Within the small, sealed circle of those who knew of the infant's existence, the monarch, his most trusted minister, the physician, and the two women now assigned as caregivers, a sterile and dehumanizing nomenclature was adopted. The child was referred to in correspondence and conversation as the charge, the ward, or simply the matter. This was a linguistic quarantine, designed to prevent the formation of any personal or emotional attachment. To name the child would be to grant it personhood, and personhood came with inherent rights and, more dangerously, potential claims. An unnamed entity was merely a biological reality to be managed, a logistical problem to be contained. The lack of a name was the first wall, its prison, a wall of intangible but absolute strength. This presented a theological crisis alongside the political one. In the deeply pious context of the 17th century, the soul of an unbaptized infant was believed to be in peril, consigned to limbo. While the child's temporal existence was an inconvenience to the state, its eternal soul was a matter of grave concern for the devout monarch. A public baptism was impossible, as it was a state ceremony that officially entered a royal into both the church and the line of succession. Like the birth itself was clandestine. One night, a week after the birth, a low-ranking priest with a reputation for unwavering loyalty was summoned to the nursery. There, with no witnesses save for the new governess and a single guard, a secret and severely abbreviated rite was performed. The ceremony was stripped of all royal trappings. There were no noble obdurants, no ceremonial oils, no proclamations. Using a simple pewter basin of water, the priest performed the essential sacrament to ensure the salvation of the infant's soul. A name had to be given for the rite to be valid, a name to be into God's register, if not man's. A simple, common name was chosen, Thomas, perhaps, or John. A name with no dynastic weight, a name with no dynastic weight, a name that would never be spoken aloud again by anyone present. It was a spiritual formality, a final transaction to settle the celestial accounts. The moment the priest departed, that name was buried, becoming the second secret layered upon the first. The child now had a soul secured for heaven, but remained a non-entity on earth. The practical consequences of this namelessness radiated through every aspect of the child's early life. Without a name, no official record of its existence could be made. Household accounts could not list expenses for a Prince John. Instead, funds were diverted through a discreet ledger, logged as special provisions for the North Wing or stipend for a physician's ward. The caregivers, a stern older governess and a young, silent nursemaid, were forbidden from using any terms of endearment. Pet names, the simple, affectionate monikers that form the basis of an infant's first bonds, were strictly prohibited. The child was to be cared for with clinical efficiency, its needs for warmth, food, uncleanliness met, but its need for recognition and identity deliberately starved. This enforced anonymity had a profound effect on the child's tiny, isolated world. Sound, which for most infants is a rich tapestry of names, lullabies, and loving nonsense, was for this child a sterile environment. The women spoke directly to the infant. The sounds it learned to associate with human presence were the rustle of a woolen dress, the soft tread of a slipper on wood, the clink of a spoon against a bowl. These were the sounds of maintenance, not of interaction. The human voice, when it came, was functional, a soothing hum during a feeding, a clipped instruction between the staff. It was a world devoid of the primary tool through which humans learn their place in the social fabric, their own name, spoken with affection. The child was being raised in a state of perfect social isolation, its identity methodically dismantled before it had a chance to form. It was a ghost in its own life, a secret held within the very heart of the kingdom, defined not by what it was, but by the myriad of things, a name, a title, a future, it was not. The physical space assigned to the child was a perfect architectural manifestation of its status. It was not a nursery in the conventional sense, a room designed for the nurture and stimulation of a developing infant. It was, rather, a vault, located at the end of a long disused corridor in the oldest part of the palace. The suite consisted of 3 rooms, arranged linearly to create a series of buffers between the child and the world. The outermost room was a small, sparsely furnished antechamber, where a single guard was posted day and night. His duty was not to guard the child, but to guard the secret of the child, ensuring that no unauthorized person, a lost courtier, a curious servant, should stumble upon the corridor. He was changed on an irregular schedule to prevent familiarity and the inevitable gossip it would breed. Beyond this antechamber lay the main room, the gilded cage itself. The first impression was one of immense, shadowed opulence. The walls were not painted but hung with heavy, dark wall tapestries. These were not the bright, cheerful hangings of a child's room. They were somber, grand-scale depictions of dynastic history, a famous battle, a royal marriage, a state procession. The woven figures were stiff, their expressions remote, their world entirely alien. The tapestries served a practical purpose beyond decoration. They absorbed sound, both from within and without, further isolating the room from the palace, and they provided a crucial layer of insulation against the damp chill that seeped from the ancient stone walls. The floor was covered by a thick, dark Persian carpet, its intricate patterns absorbing the light and muffling any footfalls. The room's primary piece of furniture was the cradle. It was a masterpiece of the woodcarver's art, hewn from dark oak and covered in elaborate carvings of royal crests and heraldic beasts, lions, eagles, and dragons. Yet its grandeur was oppressive. It was built less like a child's bed and more like a miniature bed of state, or perhaps a sarcophagus, enclosed on 3 sides with a heavy, draped canopy that could be drawn to seal it off entirely. Within this wooden fortress, the infant slept on the finest linen sheets and down pillows, a material comfort that was a mockery of its existential poverty. Light was a scarce commodity. There was a single, tall mullioned window, but it was set high in the wall, far above the eye level of a standing adult, let alone a child in a cradle. Its purpose was not to provide a view but to admit a measure of daylight sufficient for the caregivers to perform their duties. The thick-leaded glass distorted what little it revealed of the outside world, not the manicured palace gardens or the bustling courtyards, but the blank, soot-stained brick of a facing wall. The only other sources of light were a large, perpetually burning fire in a cavernous stone hearth and the soft glow of beeswax candles, which cast long dancing shadows that turned the carved furniture into monstrous shapes in the dimmings. The environment was deliberately designed to be unstimulating. There were no simple, colorful toys to grasp, no mobiles to gaze upon, no cheerful pictures on the walls. The few objects in the room were symbols of status, not tools for play. A heavy ornate silver rattle, a gift from the queen delivered by the lady-in-waiting, was far too weighty for the infant's hands and produced only a dull, unsatisfying clatter. A porcelain doll with a placid, painted face sat on a high shelf, its glass eyes staring into the middle distance, an object for display, not for comfort. The room was a museum of a life that was not being lived. It was kept meticulously clean, the air always smelling of wood-smoked floor polish, and the faint, herbal scent of the sackets used to perfume the linen chests. This sensory deprivation was a matter of policy. A stimulated child becomes a curious child. A curious child might grow loud, might seek to explore, might bang on the door or call from the window. The goal was the opposite, to foster passivity and quiescence. The quiet, unchanging, dim environment was intended to encourage long periods of sleep and to limit cognitive and physical development to a manageable minimum. The child was to be kept in a state of perpetual infancy, its world circumscribed by the four walls of the room and the bars of its cradle. This was not a space for living, but for waiting. It was a holding cell, furnished with the finest materials the kingdom could provide, where a human secret was being stored until a more permanent solution could be found. The opulence was not for the child's benefit, it was a reflection of the status of the secret it embodied. While the child's physical world was confined to the three-room suite, its existence began to create a narrative ripple in the complex human ecosystem of the palace. A secret of this magnitude, involving the direct heir to the throne, could not be contained by architectural design alone. It relied on the discipline of the few who were party to it. And this discipline was a constant battle against the natural currents of human curiosity and communication. The primary custodians of the secret were the two women assigned to the child's direct care, a senior governess, a woman named Elspeth, and a young junior nursemaid. Elspeth was a widow in her late 50s, drawn from the lesser gentry. She was chosen for her legendary discretion, her severe piety, and her lack of close family ties that might invite indiscreet questions. She understood her role not as a nurturer, but as a warden. Her instructions were explicit. The child was to be kept clean, fed, and above all, silent and under vow of silence. The nursemaid, a girl from a royal estate, was selected for her docile nature and her inability to read or write, which limited her ability to record or communicate anything she might witness. She performed the more menial tasks, changing linens, cleaning, assisting with feeding, under Elspeth's constant watchful eye. However, even this tightly controlled cell required logistical support from the outside world. Food trays had to be delivered, soiled linens had to be taken for laundering, water and firewood had to be supplied. These simple, daily transactions were the points where the secrecy was most vulnerable. The staff of the palace kitchens, the laundries, and the service corridors were not informed of the truth. They were simply given new, strange orders. A special meal, consisting of pureed foods and enriched milk, was to be prepared 3 times a day and left on a specific table in a service hallway. A particular laundress was tasked with washing a separate, small bundle of high-quality linen, often stained in a way that suggested an infant or an invalid, which was collected and returned by a palace guard. This deviation from routine created an epistemological void, and into this void, the collective imagination of the palace staff poured its own explanations. In the absence of facts, they constructed a narrative from the available evidence, interpreted through their own cultural and superstitious frameworks. The secrecy itself was the most potent piece of evidence. Palaces were designed for display, concealment was inherently suspect. The first theories were political. The rooms held a secret prisoner of high birth, a rival claimant to the throne, or perhaps a politically inconvenient illegitimate child of a high-ranking noble. These were familiar tropes of court life. But soon the rumors took a darker, more supernatural turn. The nature of the provisions, soft, simple foods, suggested an occupant who was either very young or very infirm. The laundress noted the strange, small size of the garments. A chambermaid, gossiping with a guard, heard a strange, weak cry one night, a sound she described as not quite human. These fragmented observations were pieced together in the servants' halls and kitchens, creating a chilling mosaic. The story of a stillborn prince had been the official account, but what if the child had not been stillborn? What if it had been born wrong? The 17th century mind was steeped in a belief system where the natural and supernatural worlds were deeply intertwined. The concept of the changeling, a fairy or elf child left in place of a stolen human infant, was a deeply ingrained piece of folklore, used to explain birth defects, developmental delays, or any childhood ailment that defied simple explanation. The hidden royal child fit this archetype perfectly. The story began to circulate in hushed tones. The queen had birthed a monster, an imp, a creature so horrifying that it had to be hidden away lest its appearance cursed the kingdom. The child's actual clinical characteristics, known only to the few, were unknowingly mirrored and magnified in the staff's terrified whispers. Its quiet, passive nature became evidence of its non-human soul. Its unusual facial features, glimpsed perhaps for a fleeting second by a terrified maid, were exaggerated into grotesque deformities. The ward in the North Wing was no longer a political prisoner, it was the palace demon, a living embodiment of divine wrath or satanic influence. The stern governess was cast in the role of its keeper, a woman engaged in a grim, lonely vigil against a force of evil. Her silence and severity were not seen as professionalism, but as the necessary hardness of one who deals with the unholy. The sub-rosa narrative was now fully formed, a ghost story taking place within the palace walls. Two realities now existed in parallel: the quiet, sterile, managed existence within the nursery and the terrifying, mythologized version that haunted the imaginations of those who served outside its doors. With the infant's existence now established as a guarded secret, the responsibility for its continued survival and management fell primarily to the court physician. Dr. Henry Du Bois, a man whose medical practice was a blend of empirical observation and entrenched humoral theory, approached the royal child not as a patient to be cured, but as a scientific anomaly to be documented and, if possible, understood. His initial examinations, which commenced within days of the birth and continued at irregular intervals, were meticulously recorded in a private folio, a document he kept separate from all official court records. This folio, bound in dark leather and secured with a small brass clasp, contained the most objective account of the child's early life. Du Bois's medical understanding was firmly rooted in the Galenic system, which posited that the human body was governed by four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was a state of balance, illness an imbalance. Congenital differences were often attributed to disruptions during conception or gestation, a corrupt seed, an improper blending of humors in the womb, or even maternal imagination, the belief that the mother's strong emotions or experiences during pregnancy could physically mark the child. For Du Bois, the infant's condition was clearly the result of a profound humoral disequilibrium, likely in excess of cold and moist humors that had hindered proper formation. His entries detail the infant's physical characteristics with a detached precision. He noted the oculo obliqui, the upward slanting eyes, a feature he found particularly perplexing as it resembled certain distant Eastern peoples known through travelers' accounts. The nas's brevis et depressus, a short flattened nose, was also meticulously described. Du Bois paid particular attention to the oral cavity, noting the lingua proripens, a protruding tongue, which he surmised contributed to the infant's difficulty in feeding and its frequent open-mouthed posture. He observed the auriculaiminemi et malformatei, small, irregularly shaped ears, often set lower than typical. These were not observations made with empathy, but with a clinical desire to categorize and define. The physician also recorded what he termed flaciditas corporis, the general hypotonia or low muscle tone, that rendered the infant unusually pliable. He noted the difficulty in achieving sustained head control and the delays in basic motor milestones that would typically be observed in a healthy infant. The limbs, he wrote, felt gelatinous when moved. He attempted rudimentary neurological assessments based on the knowledge of his time, observing the infant's infrequent responses to stimuli, its general lethargy, and its apparent disinterest in its surroundings. He described the infant as largely quiescent, spending long hours in sleep or in a state of quiet wakefulness, staring blankly at the above its cradle. Of particular interest to Du Bois was the linea simian line, the single palmar crease he had noted at birth. He consulted ancient texts and contemporary anatomical treatises, finding no precedent for such a consistent and striking mark. He sketched it repeatedly, theorizing about its connection to the overall malformation of the body. In his mind, It was another visible sign of a fundamental internal disorder. His notes reflect a purely mechanistic view. The body was a complex machine, and this particular machine had been assembled with visible defects. Beyond the physical, Du Bois also made cautious observations about the infant's cognitive development, or lack thereof. He noted the absence of the typical infant cooing and bubbling, the delayed social smile, and the lack of reciprocal interaction. He recorded its inability to track objects with its eyes for sustained periods in its limited vocalizations, which were mostly restricted to a low, guttural cry indicating discomfort. He concluded, in a chillingly detached phrase, that the inner faculty of reason appeared to be impaired from inception, a diagnosis that effectively relegated the child to a state of perpetual intellectual childhood, a condition he termed idiocy, a medical classification of the error. His visits to the nursery were brief, clinical affairs. He would perform his examinations, dictated by a precise set of protocols he had established for himself, and then retreat to his study to record his findings. There was no attempt at comforting the child, no gentle words exchanged, no playful interaction. The infant was a specimen, its living body a compendium of signs that pointed to a mysterious deviation from the norm. Du Bois' gaze was that of a scientist observing a rare and unfortunate phenomenon, not a doctor tending to a beloved child. His reports, written in the austere Latin of medical scholarship, served to formalize the child's status not just as a secret, but as a biological aberration, a problem to be studied and managed, rather than embraced. The scientific lens, though dispassionate, ironically offered the most objective and therefore most damning verdict on the child's existence. Following the initial phase of observation and diagnosis, Du Bois' role shifted from that of a passive cataloguer of defects to an active agent of intervention. The prevailing medical philosophy of the 17th century was not one of passive acceptance of congenital conditions. It was a proactive, often aggressive, attempt to correct nature's perceived errors. Based on his humoral diagnosis, an excess of cold, moist phlegm, Du Bois prescribed a regimen of correction, a multifaceted therapeutic approach designed to rebalance the child's internal system and, he hoped, mitigate the external manifestations of its condition. This regimen was not intended to harm, but it was conceived without any understanding of the child's underlying genetic reality and, as such, was both futile and, in its application, a source of constant discomfort. The first line of attack was dietary. Believing the child's constitution to be overly cold, Du Bois prescribed a diet of heating and drying foods. The standard infant diet of milk was to be fortified with spices like nutmeg and cinnamon, and supplemented with broths made from rooster and other hot meats. As the child grew, he forbade fruits and most vegetables, which were considered cooling, in favor of toasted breads and roasted meats, finely minced, scientifically unsound and difficult for an infant with low muscle tone and a protruding tongue to consume, often lead to digestive distress, which was then interpreted as further evidence of the body's inherent imbalance rather than a consequence of the treatment itself. The second element of the regimen was physical, to combat the laxity of the limbs and encourage proper muscular development. A system of specialized swaddling and bracing was devised. The standard practice of swaddling intended to keep an infant warm and secure was exaggerated into a form of orthopedic constraint. The child was bound for extended periods in stiffly starched linen infused with herbs believed to have firming properties. Its limbs were subjected to a rigorous program of massage and manipulation. Elspeth, the governess, was instructed to vigorously rub the child's arms and legs with warming oils and ointments, a daily procedure that was oft unmet with weak, protesting cries. As the child aged, small, custom-made wooden braces were sometimes strapped to its legs for several hours a day, in a misguided attempt to force them into a straighter alignment and promote strength for eventual walking. The third component was environmental. The nursery, already stuffy and dim, was to be kept unnaturally warm. Fires were banked high year-round, and the windows were sealed with strips of cloth to prevent any draughts of cold air from entering. The child was to be dressed in multiple layers of wool and flannel, regardless of the season, to preserve its internal heat. This constant, oppressive warmth led to chronic overheating, skin rashes, and a general state of lethargic discomfort, which was again misinterpreted as a symptom of the underlying sluggishness of its phlegmatic nature. Perhaps the most distressing part of the regimen involved attempts to correct the child's facial features, particularly the protruding tongue. Believing this to be a simple matter of muscular weakness and habit, Du Bois designed a small, soft leather strap that could be fitted around the child's head, with a padded section that applied gentle but constant pressure to the chin, intended to keep the mouth closed. This device was to be worn for several hours each day. It was uncomfortable, restrictive, and made breathing more difficult. It also hindered the natural oral explorations of an infant, further delaying the development of feeding skills and vocalizations. This intervention, born of a desire to create a more normal appearance, was a form of daily, low-grade torture. All of these interventions were meticulously documented by Du Bois in his folio. He recorded the child's reactions, the rashes, the crying, the refusal to feed, not as signs of distress, but as clinical data points in his ongoing experiment. He noted a reddening of the skin from the woolens, a peevish disposition during the massages, and a difficulty in respiration with the chin strap. Yet he saw these not as reasons to cease the treatments, but as challenges to be overcome. He would adjust the herbal composition of an ointment or modify the tension of a strap, convinced that the correct formula for normalization was just within his grasp. He was a man of science. Applying the best knowledge of his age was a constellation of incorrect assumptions. The regimen of correction, far from helping the child, only added a layer of prescribed, systematic suffering to an already isolated and sensorial lie-deprived existence. It transformed the nursery from a simple place of confinement into a laboratory where misguided therapeutic zeal was enacted daily upon a helpless subject. The regimen of correction, applied with unwavering discipline for over a year, yielded no discernible results. The child did not grow more robust, the limbs did not firm, and the facial features remained unchanged. The persistent failure of his therapies forced a subtle but significant evolution in drive. Du Bois, says Roland in the very nature of his documentation. Since he could not alter the subject, he would instead perfect the record of its immutability. Once a log of prescribed treatments and their anticipated effects, now transformed into a pure, dispassionate chronicle of developmental deviation. It became a formal project in charting aberration. Du Bois began to approach his task with the rigor of a natural philosopher, cataloguing a new and perplexing species. He developed a systematic methodology for his periodic examinations. He created charts drawing neat columns in iron-gall ink on fresh vellum pages inserted into the folio. These charts were designed to compare the child's progress against an unwritten but universally understood baseline, the expected development of a healthy, noble-born infant. Each entry in these charts became a documented failure to meet that standard. The first set of metrics was purely physical. Using a calibrated measuring tape and a set of brass scales, Du Bois recorded the child's height, weight, and cranial circumference. His notations made at the change of each season show a slow, shallow trajectory of growth. Marginalia in Latin read increment, tardum slow growth and corpus colum debile weekly body. He meticulously sketched the child's hands and feet, noting the persistent shortness of the digits and the unusually large gap between the first and second toes, a feature he labeled the sandal gap, another piece of morphological evidence for his diagnosis of systemic imperfection. The next section of his charts was dedicated to motor skills, or what he termed motus natural, his natural motion. He documented the age at which a typical infant would achieve certain milestones, and then noted the child's state at that same age. Where the chart might read lifts and controls head at 3 months, Du Bois' corresponding entry would be head control remains poor, requiring constant support. He recorded the failure to roll over, the inability to achieve a stable seated position without being propped by pillows, and later, the complete absence of any attempt at crawling. Each observation was a negative data point, confirming the child's profound departure from the norm. His notes from the child's second year expressed clinical surprise at the persistent infantile posture and the lack of ambulatory instinct. Cognitive and social development sensor set ratio formed the third, and for Du Bois' most damning area of study, he devised simple tests to gauge the child's awareness. He would produce a new object, a polished silver bell, a brightly colored ribbon, and note the child's reaction. His records are a litany of disinterest. Subject does not track the object with its eyes. No attempt to grasp or reach. The sound of the bell elicits no startle or turn of the head. He paid close attention to recognition. When the governess Elspeth entered the room, the child showed no visible sign of acknowledgement. Even during a rare, carefully orchestrated visit from the royal father, the child remained impassive, its gaze unfocused. To Du Bois, this was conclusive proof of a vacant intellect, a mind that was an unresponsive vessel. Language acquisition box set verbum was the final frontier of his investigation. He listened for the cooing and babbling that should have emerged in the first year, but recorded only guttural sounds and occasional weak cries. He watched for the imitation of sounds, a key precursor to speech, but observed none. As the child entered its third and fourth years, a period when a royal heir would be tutored in the rudiments of multiple languages, its vocalizations remained pre-verbal. The inability to form words to name objects, or to respond to simple commands was, in Du Bois's view, the ultimate confirmation of its subhuman status. The child lacked logos, the divine spark of reason and speech that separated man from beast. The folio became a monument to this perceived lack. It was a scientific text defining a human being by a series of absences. The neat script, the precise measurements, and the Latin terminology gave an objective, authoritative weight to what was a profound human tragedy. Dr. Boyce was not being cruel, in his mind. He was being a scientist. He was replacing superstitious fear with rational observation. But in doing so, he was methodically constructing an official, unassailable case for the child's irredeemable motherness. The document, locked away in his study, was more powerful than any physical wall. It was the intellectual architecture of the child's confinement, a scholarly justification for its complete and permanent erasure from the world. Dr. Du Bois's meticulously compiled folio, a testament to the methodical application of 17th-century medical science, ultimately served only to document the utter failure of that science. After nearly 3 years of prescribed regimens on detailed observation, the child's condition was fundamentally unaltered. This impulse marked a critical turning point. The problem of the royal child, having exhausted the explanatory power of medicine, was now escalated to a higher authority. Presented with Du Bois's comprehensive report on the child's incurable physical and cognitive deviations, concluded that the issue was no longer a matter for physicians. It was a matter for theologians. The leather-bound folio was passed from the hands of the doctor to those of Bishop Allard, the king's personal confessor and most trusted spiritual advisor. Allard was a man of formidable intellect, a scholar of patristics and canon law, whose worldview was shaped not by the humors of the body, but by the cosmic struggle between divine will and demonic influence. He reviewed Du Bois's clinical descriptions not as medical data, but as a dossier of signs to be interpreted for their spiritual significance. The child's physical anomalies, its profound silence, its failure to develop, these were not symptoms of a flawed constitution, but potentially a message, a trial, or a curse from God. Bishop Allard's own examination of the child was profoundly different from Du Bois's. He spent an hour in the nursery, not with measuring tapes and scales, but in quiet, intense observation. He watched for a flicker of recognition, a sign of an indwelling soul responding to the presence of a holy man. He held a small, silver crucifix before the child's eyes, noting the impassive, unfocused gaze with which it was met. He softly recited prayers in Latin, listening intently to the child's quiet breathing, searching for any sign of agitation or peace that might indicate a reaction to the sacred words. He was not diagnosing a body, he was probing a soul, attempting to determine if it was a simple, innocent vessel, or something far more troubling. Following this grim vigil, he presented his theological diagnosis to the king and a small, select council. He outlined 3 possible interpretations, each rooted in the theological orthodoxies of the age. The first and most straightforward was that the child was a form of divine punishment. It was a living symbol of God's displeasure, a flagellum Dei, scourge of God sent to chastise the royal house for some hidden sin, perhaps a secret vanity, a moment of lapsed faith, or a past political transgression committed by an ancestor. In this interpretation, The child's existence was a constant, humiliating reminder of the crown's vulnerability to divine judgment. To acknowledge the child would be to publicly admit the sin. The second interpretation was more merciful, yet equally problematic. The child could be a wholly innocent, a soul deliberately created without the faculty of reason and thus untouched by sin. Such beings were sometimes seen as being closer to God, their earthly existence a trial for those around them, a divine test of compassion, piety, and charity. The duty of the royal family, in this view, was to protect and care for this innocent creature as a secret act of devotion, thereby earning spiritual merit. While this cast the child in a less sinister light, it still presented an intractable political problem. The care of a holy fool was one thing, the presence of one in the direct line of succession was another. The third and most alarming possibility, one that resonated with the dark whispers already circulating among the palace staff, was that the child was a product of demonic interference. Bishop Allard, a scholar of exorcism and demonology, explained that Satan often sought to mock God's creation by twisting the human form. A malformed child in a royal bloodline was a particularly potent act of spiritual warfare, designed to introduce a flaw, a point of corruption, into a dynasty that ruled by divine right. The child itself might not be evil, but its physical form could be the result of a satanic imprint on the womb, or in the most extreme view, its body could be a potential vessel for a malevolent spirit. This final diagnosis, though presented as a mere possibility, carried the most weight. It aligned with the deep-seated fears of the heir and provided the most compelling justification for the extreme measures of secrecy already in place. The child was no longer merely a dynastic embarrassment or a medical tragedy. It was now classified as a potential spiritual contaminant. Its isolation was reframed, no longer just a political necessity to protect the line of succession, but a spiritual quarantine to protect the very soul of the kingdom from a potential source of demonic corruption. The official language surrounding the charge shifted accordingly. In the secret councils, the terminology became theological. It was now the affliction, the trial, or our cross to bear. This reframing had a profound effect. It placed the child's fate entirely in the hands of the king and his spiritual advisors, removing it from the realm of family or medicine. The decision of what to do next was no longer about therapy or management, but about spiritual hygiene and the preservation of divine order. The child, silent and unaware in its gilded room, had been tried in a celestial court and found wanting. Its continued existence was now predicated on its ability to remain a perfect, hermetically sealed secret. Lest the curse it embodied break containment infect the state. While the physicians and theologians debated the nature of the child's existence in clinical and spiritual terms, the child itself continued to exist in a state of profound sensory deprivation. Its reality was not defined by its diagnosis, but by the immediate, circumscribed world of its rooms. This world was a carefully curated void, designed for containment, yet, even in this void, the senses could not be entirely extinguished. They became attuned to the faintest signals, interpreting the muffled and distorted inputs from the world beyond its door as the only reality it knew. The most significant of these sensory inputs was sound. The nursery was built of stone and draped in heavy wool, an acoustic dead zone. But the palace, a living organism of hundreds of individuals, was never truly silent. Sounds from the outside world penetrated the isolation, not as distinct messages, but as a kind of auditory weather, a shifting background hum against which the silence of the room was measured. The child's developing brain, starved of direct interaction, learned to pass these faint vibrations for meaning. Rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer from the royal muse was perhaps the first external pattern. It learned to recognize a steady, predictable beat in the otherwise formless soundscape. The rumble of carriage wheels on the cobblestones of a far-off courtyard signaled arrivals and departures, events of which it had no visual or social concept, but which registered as a change in the low-frequency vibrations felt through the floor. Music was the most enigmatic of these intrusions. On evenings of state balls or banquets, the faint, ghostly strains of a string consort or the percussive pulse of a courtly dance would travel through the palace's labyrinthine corridors. To the child, lying in its cradle, this was not music in the cultural sense. It was a complex, rising and falling murmur, a structured and harmonious sound utterly different from the functional noises of its immediate environment, the crackle of the fire, the rustle of Elspeth's dress, the clink of cutlery. It was an echo of a joy and a social order it could not comprehend, a phantom language of celebration from a world to which it did not belong. The human voice, the most crucial sound for a developing child, was the most severely restricted. The governess and the nursemaid spoke to each other in low, conspiratorial whispers, their words deliberately kept from the child's ears. The child learned to associate the sibilant hiss of whispering with the presence of others, but it had no model for the open, expressive tones of normal conversation. The voices it heard most clearly were those of the guards in the antechamber. It could perceive the gruff, masculine timbre of their speech, the occasional sharp command, or the low rumble of laughter. These sounds were disembodied, belonging to no face or person, yet they represented an alternate form of human vocalization, louder, harsher, and more dynamic than the hushed tones of its female caregivers. The passing seasons were also experienced primarily through sound. The furious howl of a winter wind rattling the leaded glass of the high window was a terrifying, elemental force. The gentle, persistent drumming of spring rain on the slate roof was a soothing, monotonous rhythm. In summer, the distant shouts of children playing in a secluded garden, their high-pitched cries of excitement and laughter, were perhaps the most painful sounds of all. They were evidence of a different kind of childhood, a life of freedom, play, and companionship that was as alien to the child's experience as the music of the spheres. These sounds, filtered and faint, were tantalizing glimpses of a life being lived elsewhere. This auditory landscape shaped the child's perception in fundamental ways. Lacking the visual and social context to interpret these sounds, it likely developed a unique and idiosyncratic understanding of the world. The rhythmic hammering was not work, it was a heartbeat. The distant music was not celebration, it was the palace breathing. The shouts of other children were not play, they were the cries of strange, unit and fightable creatures. Its world was populated by these acoustic ghosts. This sensory existence, lived at the periphery of the court's vibrant life, was the ultimate expression of the child's isolation. It was physically present within the palace walls, yet it was auditory exiled. It heard the symphony of royal life but could not see the orchestra or understand the score. The sounds were a constant, subliminal reminder of its exclusion. They were the evidence of a feast to which it would never be invited, a conversation in which it would never participate, a world from which it was born already banished. The silence within its room was not an absence of sound, but the presence of a barrier, a thick wall of quiet that separated its life from the lives of everyone else. Within this hermetically sealed world, the child's entire existence was mediated by one person, Elspeth, the governess. A woman in her late 50s, she was the fixed center of the child's universe, the sole administrator of its daily life. Her position was one of profound and unusual complexity, a constant negotiation between the cold dictates of her employment and the unbidden, inconvenient stirrings of human instinct. She had been hired for her reputation as a woman of severe discipline and unwavering loyalty, a warden who could be trusted to manage a state secret without succumbing to sentimentality. For years, she performed her duties with the detached efficiency of a machine. Her daily routine was unvarying, the liturgy of maintenance. She rose before dawn, ensuring the fire was lit and the room warmed. She oversaw the changing of linens, the preparation of meals, and the administration of the various discounts brought up to Du Bois. She kept a meticulous log, a simple record of feedings and bodily functions, which was periodically reviewed by the physician. Her movements were economical, her expressions perpetually neutral, her voice, when used at all, was low and functional. She was the embodiment of the state's will, the human instrument of the child's erasure. However, the constant, unrelenting proximity to a helpless being began to erode the foundations of her professional detachment. This was not a sudden or dramatic change, but a slow, almost imperceptible process of attrition. It began with small, unconscious acts of accommodation. She might linger a moment longer after feeding, her hand resting on the child's back. She might find herself humming a simple, tuneless melody while rocking the cradle, a half-remembered lullaby from a life before her service at court. These were minor lapses in protocol, small rebellions against the sterile regime she was meant to enforce. The source of this internal conflict was the child's absolute dependency. Unlike the courtiers and royals she had served in the past, who were masters of artifice and manipulation, the child was a creature of pure, unfiltered need. Its cries were not calculated, they were genuine expressions of discomfort or hunger. Its rare, fleeting moments of quiet contentment were not performances, they were authentic. This raw, pre-social honesty was a force that Elspeth, for all her practiced austerity, was not equipped to resist indefinitely. She was the sole witness to the child's existence, the only person to see it not as a dynastic problem or a medical specimen, but as a living, breathing being. A critical shift occurred as the child grew older and its physical needs became more complex. Elspeth was the one who had to coax it to eat the unpalatable prescribed diet, who had to soothe its rushes caused by the woolen clothing. She was the one who saw the frustration in its eyes when it was unable to make its limbs obey its will. She became the sole repository of its nonverbal language of discomfort and contentment. One for pain, one for loneliness. This intimate knowledge created a bond, whether she willed it or not. Her attachment manifested in subtle but significant ways. She began to quietly defy drive. Du Bois's more extreme prescriptions. She might forget to apply the chin strap for a day, or loosen the orthopedic braces when the child's whimpering became too persistent. She started adding a small amount of honey to the bland purees to make them more palatable, an act of culinary treason she never recorded in her log, secret kindness that asserted a moral claim over her professional duty. She was creating a microculture of care within the larger culture of containment. This growing affection placed Elspeth in a position of extreme psychological peril. Her entire livelihood and personal safety depended on her maintaining the secret and obeying her orders. Yet she was developing a powerful, protective bond with the very subject of that secret. She became fiercely possessive of the child's space, viewing the periodic visits from drive, Du Bois or Bishopal Ard as intrusive violations. The nursemaid, once her subordinate, became a potential threat, a witness to her small acts of compassion. Elspeth's communication with the younger woman grew even more clipped and guarded, her supervision more intense. The nursery became her fortress, and she was its sole, conflicted guardian. She was trapped between the pity she felt for the silent, helpless child and the fear she harbored for the powerful men who controlled both their fates. Her face remained a mask of stern neutrality, but behind it, a dangerous and forbidden attachment was taking root. The bond forming between Elspeth and the child was necessarily a silent one. The express prohibition against using a name, coupled with the governess's natural reticence and the overarching need for secrecy, meant that the primary channel of human communication, spoken language, was almost entirely absent. Yet, in this enforced silence, a different form of language began to emerge. It was a lexicon of gestures, sounds, and rituals. A unique and private dialect developed in the crucible of their shared isolation. This non-verbal communication system became the true medium of their relationship, a language understood by only two people in the world. Its origins were practical, rooted in the daily routines of care. A particular series of soft pats on the child's back came to signify that a meal was finished. A specific, low humming sound, different from her absent-minded melodies, was used to signal the discomfort of a linen change. The child, in turn, developed its own signals. A slight tensing of its body and a low, guttural grunt became its way of indicating hunger, a signal Elspeth learned to recognize and respond to far more quickly than the young nursemaid. A frantic, unfocused kicking of its legs was a clear sign of the pain from the leg braces, prompting Elspeth to surreptitiously loosen them. Over time, this rudimentary signaling evolved into a more complex and nuanced system of interaction. Elspeth discovered that while the child rarely made eye contact, it was highly responsive to touch. She developed a language of the hands. A gentle, circular rubbing on the child's palm became a gesture of reassurance during the physician's stressful visits. A slow, rhythmic stroking of its hair was a means of inducing sleep. The child learned to respond in kind. its own form of communication limited by its poor motor control but expressive nonetheless. It would sometimes press its head back against her hand, a clear sign of contentment. On rare occasions it would manage to weakly grasp one of her fingers, a fleeting but powerful act of connection. Sound also played a crucial role. While formal language was forbidden, certain sounds were permitted as part of the management of the child. Elspeth began to imbue these sounds with specific meanings. The soft clicking of her tongue became a gentle admonishment when the child resisted feeding. A drawn-out, soothing chest sound was a universal signifier of comfort. The child, whose own vocalizations were limited, began to mimic these sounds in its own way. Its attempts were imprecise. A wet, smacking sound in imitation of the click, a breathy sigh in response to the sheh. But the intent to communicate was clear. This was the beginning of a dialogue, a call and response, that existed entirely outside the realm of human speech. Ritual became a cornerstone of their shared language. The day was structured around a series of unvarying events, and this predictability provided a framework for understanding. The precise way Elspeth opened the heavy curtains in the morning, letting in the dim light, was the signal that the day had begun. The specific sequence of preparing the evening meal, the grinding of toasted bread, the warming of the broth, was the unspoken announcement that sleep was approaching. These rituals were their shared grammar. They allowed the child to anticipate events, to find a small measure of security and order in its otherwise chaotic and incomprehensible existence. For a mind that could not grasp abstract concepts like time, these concrete, sequential acts were the only calendar it had. This private language had a profound effect on both participants. For the child, it was a lifeline. It was the first and only system that allowed it to exert some minimal agency over its world, to express its needs and feel them understood. It was the foundation of its first human bond, a confirmation that it was not entirely alone. For Elspeth, it was both a comfort and a source of immense guilt. Each new gesture she taught or learned was an act of deeper emotional investment, a further violation of the cold detachment her role demanded. She was teaching the child to be human, a fact she had to conceal from her employers who saw it as something less. The sacred language was a testament to their forbidden relationship, a silent conspiracy against the silence that was supposed to define them. It was a fragile, beautiful, and incredibly dangerous creation. For the first several years of its life, the child's understanding of itself was purely somatic. It existed as a collection of physical sensations, the persistent pressure of swaddling clothes, the warmth of the fire, the dull ache in its limbs from the corrective braces, the alternating states of hunger and satiety. Its identity, such as it was confined to the boundaries of its own skin. It had no external reference point, no concept of other against which to measure self. This state of unresulted existence was shattered by a single, accidental encounter with a piece of furniture, a tall, ornate-looking glass. The mirror was a permanent fixture in the main room of the suite, a magnificent object framed in heavily carved and gilded wood. It had been placed there generations ago and was too cumbersome to be moved. For the most part, it went unnoticed. Its silvered surface was often tarnished, and from the low vantage point of the cradle, it reflected nothing but the dark, vaulted ceiling. Elspeth in her daily duties paid it no mind. Her own reflection, a familiar, grim-faced ghost she had long learned to ignore. The child, with its poor eyesight and limited mobility, had never truly seen into its depths. The moment of revelation occurred when the child was approximately 4 years of age. Elspeth, in a moment of unusual tenderness, had lifted the child from its cradle and was holding it, attempting to soothe the fit of restless crying. As she paced the room, her path took her directly in front of the tall mirror. For the first time, the child was at the right heightened proximity to see a clear image. What it saw was at the right heightened proximity to see a clear image. What it saw was profoundly confusing, a tableau of 3 figures, her severe face softened slightly by concern. Held in her arms was a child, a strange, pale creature with a flattened face and wide-set, slanted eyes. And most perplexingly, there was a third entity, the observer, the self who was witnessing this scene. The initial reaction was not one of recognition but of curiosity and fear. The child in the mirror was a stranger. It was a silent, still playmate in a world that had none. The child, held in Elspeth's arms, might have reached out a tentative hand, only to see the stranger in the glass do the exact same thing, their fingers meeting on the cold, hard surface. This mimicry was a source of profound cognitive dissonance. The child could feel its own arm moving, but it could see another being performing the identical action. The link between internal will and external reality was being demonstrated in a way that was both magical and deeply unsettling. Over the following weeks and months, the mirror became a focal point of the child's limited world. Elspeth, noticing the child's fascination and perhaps seeing it as a harmless form of stimulation, would occasionally hold it up to the glass. These encounters became a slow, painful process of self-discovery. The child began to connect the movements of the image to its own bodily sensations. When it opened its mouth, the child in the mirror did the same, revealing a similar, protruding tongue. The face in the mirror contorted in a mask of silent, identical grief. This was the process through which the child first learned of its own physical uniqueness. It had no healthy sibling, no other children, no illustrated books to provide a model for what a normal child looked like. The only human faces it knew were those of Elspeth and the nursemaid, and occasionally the severe, bearded visages of Dr. Dubois or Bishop Ard. It now had incontrovertible, visual proof that its own face was drastically different. The flat profile, the shape of the eyes, the cast of its features, these were not universal traits but specific, personal deformities. The psychological impact of this revelation can only be inferred, but it was likely immense. The mirror did not just reveal an image, it objectified the self. The child was, for the first time, able to see itself as others saw it, as an object of clinical study, of theological debate, of fear and secrecy. The mirror confirmed the unspoken truth of its isolation. It was hidden away not just because it was a secret, but because it was a secret, but because it was visibly, fundamentally different. The reflection in the looking glass became a silent accuser, a constant reminder of its own aberration. It was the beginning of a self-awareness that was inextricably linked with a sense of shame and otherness. The gilded nursery, once a simple physical prison, now gained a new psychological dimension. It was a space designed to contain not just a person, but a specific, flawed image that must never be seen by the outside world. The mirror, a symbol of vanity and truth, had delivered its brutal, silent verdict. As the years passed in silence and seclusion, the political reality outside the nursery walls continued to evolve. The king and queen had subsequently produced a second child, a son, a robust and healthy prince who met every developmental milestone with textbook precision. This boy, celebrated from birth with canonade-descent public feasts, was the embodiment of dynastic hope, the perfect heir. His existence threw the sequest into even starker relief. The firstborn was a state secret. The second was the state's future. The contrast created a dangerous internal pressure within the royal family, a psychological imbalance that the queen, in particular, felt compelled to address. Driven by a complex mixture of residual maternal guilt, morbid curiosity, and perhaps a faint, desperate hope that the elder child's condition had been exaggerated, the queen insisted on orchestrating a meeting between the two siblings. The proposal was met with strenuous objections from the king's advisors and Bishop Allard, who argued that it was an unnecessary and perilous risk to the carefully maintained secrecy. Any interaction could expose the younger prince to the affliction, in a spiritual sense, or at the very least confuse and frighten him. But the queen was adamant. She framed the meeting as a private, familial matter, a test to see if some semblance of a bond, a flicker of fraternal recognition, might be possible. Reluctantly, the king consented. The encounter was planned with the logistical precision of a military operation. It was to take place in the elder child's nursery, a neutral ground where it felt most secure, but one which held a palpable sense of dread for the visitors. The younger prince, then about 5 years old, a bright, inquisitive, and thoroughly indulged child, was told only that he was going to visit a special cousin, who was unwell. He was accompanied by his mother, the queen, and a single trusted lady-in-waiting. Bishop Allard also insisted on being present, positioning himself in a dark corner of the room, a silent spiritual sentinel. The moment the small, vibrant prince entered the dim, stuffy nursery, the atmospheric contrast was immediate and jarring. He was a creature of sunlight, dressed in bright silks, his movements quick and confident. The elder child, now around 7 years of age, was sitting passively on a thick rug near the fire, dressed in the drab, functional garments Elspeth favored. It looked up slowly, its movements sluggish, its expression blank. The two children simply stared at each other across the room, inhabitants of entirely different planets. The younger prince, bold and accustomed to being the center of attention, was the first to act. He approached his silent sibling with a child's unfiltered curiosity, his head tilted. He pointed a small gloved finger. He announced to his mother, his voice a clear, high-pitched bell in the oppressive quiet. The statement, the simple, objective observation from a child, landed with the force of a physical blow. The queen flinched. Her lady-in-waiting looked at the floor, and Elspeth, standing stiffly by the wall, subtly moved to place herself nearer to her charge. The elder child did not react to the words which it likely did not understand, but it did react to the prince's proximity and his sudden, quick movements. It recoiled slightly, pulling its arms in toward its body and letting out a low, guttural noise of distress. This sound, unfamiliar and unsettling, startled the young prince. His curiosity curdled into fear. He took a step back, his bravado vanishing, and sought the security of his mother's skirts. "I don't like him," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He is strange." The queen, her face a mask of strained composure, knelt and tried to coax her younger son forward again. "Go on," she urged, "offer your brother the toy." She pressed a small, finely carved wooden horse into his hand. But the prince refused, shaking his head and hiding his face in the folds of her gown. The experiment had failed. The two children were not just siblings separated by circumstance, they were fundamentally alien to one another. There was no flicker of recognition, no nascent bond, only a profound and insurmountable gulf of incomprehension, error, and fear. Bishop Allard stepped forward from the shadows, his presence filling the room. "Your Majesty," he said in a low, definitive tone, "this is sufficient. The trial has been made." His words carried the weight of a final judgment. The queen, her hopes dashed, looked from the terrified face of her perfect son to the blank, impassive face of her broken one. The meeting was brought to an abrupt end. The prince was quickly ushered out of the room, his mother following, leaving the nursery to fall back into its familiar, heavy silence. The encounter, intended to potentially bridge a gap, had instead concretized the wall between the two worlds. It served as the final, irrefutable proof to the court's inner circle that no integration was possible. The elder child was not just a secret to be kept, but a reality from which the future king, and by extension the kingdom itself, had to be permanently and absolutely protected. The failed encounter between the siblings had a decisive, chilling effect on the king's perception of his firstborn. Any lingering sentiment, any vestige of paternal duty that might have troubled his conscience, was effectively extinguished. The child, which had existed in his mind as an abstract problem, a distant and unfortunate matter, had now been witnessed through the terrified eyes of his healthy, legitimate heir. This vicarious experience solidified his resolve. The secret could not simply be maintained, it had to be managed with a new and final sense of purpose. Sometime in the weeks following the disastrous meeting, the king made a rare, unannounced visit to the nursery. It was not a visit of compassion, but of cold, final assessment. He arrived alone, dismissing the guard at the antechamber with a curt gesture. His sudden appearance, a stark figure of authority silhouetted in the doorway, startled Elspeth, who dropped into a deep, reflexive curtsy. The child, seated on the floor with a collection of smooth, wooden blocks, showed no reaction, its attention remaining fixed on its simple task. The king did not approach it. He remained near the door, his hand resting on the pommel of his ceremonial sword, his posture that of a general surveying a strategic liability. For several minutes he said nothing, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the oppressive tapestries, the dim light, the oppressive quiet. His expression was unreadable, a mask of regal detachment. He was not seeing a child's living space, he was inspecting a holding cell, evaluating the security of its protocols. He observed Elspeth, her rigid posture, the fear in her eyes, and seemed satisfied with her cowed demeanor. He noted the nursemaid, who had retreated to the farthest corner of the room, effectively trying to merge with the shadows. Then his attention settled on the child. He watched it as one might watch a strange, captive animal. He observed its slow, clumsy attempts to stack the blocks, its limited manual dexterity, the way its tongue protruded in concentration. He noted its physical form, its small stature for its age, its disproportionate limbs, its placid, vacant expression. Dr. Dice's clinical reports and Bishop Allard's theological diagnoses were now manifest before him, a living embodiment of dynastic failure. He was not seeing a son, he was seeing a flaw in his bloodline, a biological error that threatened the carefully constructed edifice of his power. Finally he spoke, his voice slow and devoid of any emotion. "Does it speak?" he asked Elspeth, his gaze still fixed on the child. The use of the pronoun it was deliberate, a final act of depersonalization. "No, Your Majesty," Elspeth replied, her own voice barely a whisper, only sounds. "Does it understand commands? Simple ones at times, to come, to sit, if gestured to? Does it show affection?" The king pressed, a question that seemed more a test of Elspeth's own loyalties than a genuine inquiry about the child. There was a brief, perilous hesitation before Elspeth answered. "It is quiescent, Your Majesty. It knows who provides its care." The carefully chosen words conveyed dependency, not love, a distinction she knew was critical for her own survival. The king gave a slow, deliberate nod, his assessment seemingly complete. He had seen all he needed to see. The child was not merely imperfect, it was an empty vessel. It lacked the essential qualities of a monarch, or even of a fully realized human being as he understood it. It had no reason, no speech, no capacity for the complex social and political maneuvering that defined his world. It was a genetic dead end, a biological artifact that had to be archived away from the living history of his dynasty. He turned to leave, pausing at the door to deliver his final, unspoken verdict in the form of a command to the governess. "Continue as you are," he said. "Your discretion is noted." With that he was gone, the heavy door closing with a soft final thud. The visit had lasted no more than 10 minutes. In that time, no word was spoken to the child, no gesture of acknowledgement was made in its direction. It was an evaluation conducted, as if the subject were not even present. The king's purpose had been to confirm, with his own eyes, the necessity of the child's permanent and total erasure. He left the nursery with his resolve hardened, his conscience clear. The child was not a person to be nurtured or even pitied. It was a problem of state, and the time for a permanent solution was fast approaching. The king's personal revulsion, confirmed by his brief, dispassionate visit to the nursery, was merely the emotional core of a much larger, colder reality, the ironclad mathematic survival. The child's existence was not simply a private shame, it was a profound and dangerous structural flaw in the architecture of the state. To understand the decision that was now forming in the king's mind, one must move beyond the dim confines of the nursery and into the brightly lit mat rooms and council chambers where the fate of nations was decided. The problem of the firstborn was, at its heart, a problem of precedence. The foundational principle of European monarchy in the 17th century was primogeniture, the right of the firstborn, particularly the firstborn son, to inherit the entirety of the father's estate, titles, and power. This was not a mere tradition, it was the legal and political bedrock that prevented the endless fragmentation of kingdoms and the perpetual civil wars that had plagued earlier eras. The law was absolute and impersonal. It did not account for ability, temperament, or physical health. The moment the first child was born and drew breath, it was, by the immutable law of God and man, the heir apparent. Legally, the silent, sequestered child was the future of the kingdom. The healthy, vibrant prince was merely the spare. This created an intractable paradox. To acknowledge the first child's existence would be to place it officially in the line of succession. This would mean that, upon the king's death, the crown would legally pass to an individual who could not speak, reason, or rule. Such a situation would necessitate a regency, a period where a powerful noble or a council would rule in the monarch's name. History had shown that regencies were periods of profound instability, ripe for factionalism, court intrigue, and outright rebellion. Powerful dukes and ambitious cousins would vie for control of the imbecile king, effectively using the legitimate monarch as a puppet to advance their own interests. The kingdom would bleed. The alternative to publicly designate the firstborn in favor of the second was equally perilous. There was no established legal mechanism for such an act. To set aside the rightful heir based on physical or mental incapacity would be to set a revolutionary precedent. It would imply that the right to rule was conditional based on merit rather than blood. If one heir could be set aside for being an imbecile, could not another be set aside for being unpopular or impious? It would open the door for any powerful faction to challenge any future succession they disliked, shattering the very principle of absolute, divinely ordained inheritance. Furthermore, a public disinheritance would require a public explanation, forcing the royal family to openly admit to the flaw in their bloodline, a humiliation that would be a potent weapon in the hands of foreign rivals. Beyond the internal stability of the kingdom, the child's existence was a catastrophic liability in the arena of international diplomacy. The primary currency of statecraft was the strategic marriage alliance. Royal children were the kingdom's most valuable assets. Their hands in marriage traded for peace treaties, military alliances, and territorial claims. A healthy heir was expected to marry a foreign princess of equal standing, a Spanish infante, an Austrian archduchess, thereby securing the dynasty for another generation and cementing a powerful international coalition. The sequestered child had zero value in this ruthless marketplace. No foreign power would wed their daughter to a monster, an idiot. The child's existence, as the legal heir, effectively froze the kingdom's diplomatic strategy. The second, healthy son could not be offered in marriage contracts as the primary party, as he was not the heir. The firstborn's life was a permanent, crippling obstacle to the nation's foreign policy. Therefore, the king was trapped in a political and legal checkmate. He could not acknowledge his firstborn without inviting civil war. He could not disinherit without shattering the foundation of his own legitimacy. He could not use it to secure the kingdom's future through marriage. From the cold, pragmatic perspective of 17th century statecraft, the child was not a person. It was a constitutional crisis in human form. Its continued, secret existence was a ticking bomb at the heart of the court. Every day it lived, the risk of discovery grew, and with it, the risk of a catastrophic succession crisis that couldn't do a century of nation building. The personal decision made by the king after his visit was now reinforced by the unassailable logic of political necessity. A solution had to be found, one that would remove the problem permanently and without a trace, allowing the second son to seamlessly and legally assume the position of heir apparent. The king's personal resolve and the clear logic of dynastic security now converged, moving the matter of the firstborn from a state of passive containment to one of active resolution. The next phase of the process took place not in the nursery or the king's private study, but in the formal setting of the Privy Council. This was the kingdom's innermost circle of power, a small assembly of the highest-ranking ministers, the Lord Chancellor, the Treasurer, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State. For matters of this gravity, the silent, observing presence of Bishop Ward. It was here that the child's fate would be debated not as a familial tragedy, but as an item on the state agenda. The meetings were held in secret, often late at night, after the normal business of the court had concluded. The subject was never named in the official minutes of the council. It was referred to with the same coded language that had been used since its birth: the ward, the northern charge, or simply the impediment. The councillors, men hardened by decades of political maneuvering, approached the topic with a profound lack of sentiment, and this was a tumor that needed to be excised before it became malignant. The king opened the first of these special sessions by formally presenting the problem. He laid out the unassailable facts as he saw them. He summarized Dr. Du Bois's medical findings, stressing the finality of the diagnosis. The condition was congenital, permanent, and resulted in a complete absence of the faculties required for rule. He then recounted the bishop's theological interpretations, subtly emphasizing the possibility of a spiritual taint that posed a risk to the realm. Finally, and most powerfully, he detailed the constitutional crisis posed by the laws of primogeniture. The case was presented not as a father's dilemma, but as a sovereign's duty to protect the stability and future of the kingdom. The council's initial deliberations focused on reviewing all possible scenarios, methodically examining and discarding each one. The option of a public acknowledgement followed by a regency was dismissed almost immediately. The Lord Chancellor, a man whose life was dedicated to the letter of the law, outlined the inevitable legal challenges and factional power struggles such a move would unleash. He cited historical precedents from neighboring kingdoms where similar situations had led to decades of bloodshed. The risk was deemed unacceptable. The option of a formal, public disinheritance was also rejected. The Secretary of State, a master of foreign policy, argued that the act would be perceived internationally as a sign of profound dynastic weakness. Rival monarchs would exploit the admission of a tainted bloodline for propaganda purposes, and the legitimacy of the second son, and indeed all future heirs, could be forever questioned. It would be a self-inflicted wound from which the monarchy might never recover. With the public options eliminated, the discussion turned to clandestine solutions. The first proposal, favored by the more cautious members of the council, was to simply continue the current policy of containment indefinitely. The child would live out its natural life in secrecy, guarded and cared for, and upon its death, the problem would resolve itself. However, this was countered by the argument that this approach was merely a postponement of risk, not a removal of it. Over a long period, the secret was more, not less, likely to be exposed. A change in government, the death of a key conspirator like Elspeth or Drive, Du Bois, a simple slip of the tongue by a guard, any of these could bring the entire edifice of secrecy crashing down. As the less palatable options were stripped away, the logic of the situation inexorably led the council toward a more permanent, final solution. The language used was euphemistic and indirect, but its meaning was clear. The impediment had to be removed. The discussion was no longer about if a definitive action should be taken, but how and when. The treasurer spoke of the ongoing financial drain of the secret household, a small but constant leakage of funds that created an auditable trail. The Lord Chancellor worried about the legal vacuum created by an unperson who nonetheless had a valid, if unasserted, claim to the throne. Bishop Allard spoke in grave, abstract terms about the necessity of cleansing the kingdom of any potential spiritual affliction, providing a moral and theological justification for what was being considered. In these late-night sessions, under the flickering candlelight of the council chamber, the child ceased to be a living being. It was abstracted into a political variable, a legal paradox, a threat to national security. Its humanity was irrelevant to the cold calculus of power. The men in the room were not monsters. They were patriots and pragmatists, products of a ruthless age. They were making a decision they believed was necessary for the survival of the state they had sworn to serve. The child in the northern wing, oblivious, had become an item on an agenda, a problem whose only remaining question was the method of its final resolution. With the Privy Council in consensus that the existing arrangement was an unsustainable risk, the deliberations shifted to the specific methodology of the child's permanent removal. Outright violence, a quiet accident, or a subtle poisoning was briefly considered and immediately dismissed. Such an act was too crude, too dangerous, and for the devout king and his bishop, a mortal sin that could damn their souls. The goal was not to commit a murder, but to enact a form of civic death. The child needed to be removed from the world so completely that it would be as if it had never existed, a process that must be executed without bloodshed and with the utmost discretion. It was in this context that the primary proposal emerged, the monastery option. This was a well-established, if rarely used to-love statecraft for dealing with inconvenient members of a royal or noble family. A younger son with rebellious tendencies, a daughter who refused an arranged marriage, or a politically troublesome cousin could be encouraged to take holy vows. Once cloistered within the walls of a remote monastery or convent, they were legally and socially dead to the outside world. They renounced all titles, claims, and worldly possessions. It was a clean, elegant, and spiritually sanctioned method of political erasure. Applying this solution to the royal child, however, required significant and novel modifications. The plan was articulated by Bishop Allard, who saw it as the most humane and theologically sound resolution. He proposed that the child be transferred to a religious institution, not as a novice taking vows, but as a permanent, anonymous ward of the church. The key was selecting the correct institution. It could not be a grand, politically connected abbey whose abbot might recognize the significance of such a special charge. Instead, Allard identified a small, isolated charter house belonging to a semi-hermitite order, situated in a rugged, sparsely populated mountain region on the kingdom's furthest frontier. The chosen location was perfect for several reasons. Firstly, its remoteness made it almost inaccessible. The journey there was long and arduous, and the surrounding lands were inhospitable, discouraging casual visitors or calls. Secondly, the order itself was known for its strict vow of silence and its complete disconnection from worldly affairs. The monks lived in individual cells, devoted their lives to prayer and contemplation, and had minimal contact even with one another, let alone the outside world. They were guardians of secrets by vocation. An anonymous new charge could be absorbed into their silent routine with few questions asked. Thirdly, the prior of this particular charter house was a man known personally to Bishop Allard, a man of simple, unquestioning faith and absolute loyalty to the crown. He would not need to be told the full truth. He would simply be informed by his ecclesiastical superior that a special soul, an innocent touched by God's mysterious will, was being placed in his monastery as perpetual care, as a secret act of royal piety. A declared endowment from the king's private treasury would accompany the child, ensuring the monastery's financial security for a century to come and guaranteeing their complicity and silence. The plan for the child's life within the monastery was laid out in detail. It would be housed in a small, self-contained cottage on the monastery grounds, originally built for a lay brother. One or two elderly, trusted monks, sworn to a special vow of secrecy, would be assigned to its care. They would see to its basic needs: food, warmth, cleanliness, with the same dispassionate piety they applied to their other duties. The child would live out its days in the shadow of the chapel, within the sound of the monastic bells, its existence known only to a handful of silent monks and its identity known to no one, not even the prior himself. This solution offered a perfect synthesis of pragmatism and piety. For the state, it was a permanent and irreversible removal. The child would effectively vanish from the face of the earth, its legal claim to the throne dissolving within the sacred walls of the charter house. For the king's conscience, it was not an act of murder, but an act of charity, entrusting a helpless soul to the care of God's servants. The child would be safe, cared for, and its soul prayed for daily. Should one ever be needed for the inner circle, would be that the ward had been placed in a secure, devout, and permanent sanctuary. The council unanimously approved the proposal. It was clean, final, and defensible in both a political and a moral sense. The Secretary of State was tasked with discreetly arranging the financial endowment. Bishop Allard would personally handle the communication with the prior. The Lord Chancellor was satisfied that this civic death effectively nullified the legal threat of succession. The king gave his final assent. The monastery option was no longer a proposal. It was a decreed course of action. The only remaining variables were the timing and logistics of the transfer. The Privy Council's decision to enact the monastery option brought a sense of grim, administrative relief to the king's inner circle. A final, workable solution had been found. The machinery of the state began to move, but with deliberate, cautious slowness. The transfer was a delicate operation that required meticulous planning to ensure absolute secrecy. The intention was to wait for the deep cover of winter, a season when travel was difficult and the court's attention was focused inward. This period of calm deliberation, a belief that they had time to perfect their plan, was to be unexpectedly and violently truncated by the one force that no monarch could entirely control: a whisper. The first sign of trouble came from within the palace itself. The sub-rosa narrative of the palace demon, which had been circulating for years among the lower staff, began to mutate. The amorphous ghost started to coalesce around more specific, and therefore more dangerous, details. A junior stablehand, having spoken to a guard, mentioned a special, unmarked carriage that was kept in a state of constant readiness in a disused stable. A scullery maid claimed to have seen the severe governess, Elspeth, accepting a food tray that contained not a man's meal but a child's. These were minor, fragmented data points, but when pieced together in the gossip-fueled environment of the servants' quarters, they began to form a coherent, albeit incorrect, theory. The king was keeping a secret, illegitimate child hidden within the palace. This version of the story, while factually wrong, was in some ways more dangerous than the supernatural one. A demon was a matter for priests. A bastard with a potential claim to the throne was a matter for politicians. The rumor, once it reached this stage, inevitably traveled upward through the social strata of the court. A minor courtier, hoping to curry favor, reported the servant's chatter to his patron. The patron, a duke with a long-standing rivalry with the king's chief minister, saw a potential weapon. While he did not dare voice the rumor openly, he began to make veiled allusions in conversation, testing the waters, hinting that the king's household was not as orderly as it appeared. The king's spy master, a man whose entire function was to monitor the mood and whispers of the court, soon detected these tremors. He reported to the council that the containment of the secret was failing. The perimeter of silence had been breached. This news was deeply troubling, but it was still considered a manageable, internal problem. The duke could be warned, the courtier transferred, the servants questioned and reassigned. The council felt it still had control. The true crisis came not from within, but from without. During a formal reception for a visiting foreign delegation, the ambassador from the kingdom's chief rival, a man renowned for his silver tongue and his razor-sharp political instincts, requested a brief, private word with the king. In a quiet alcove, away from the music in the crowds, the ambassador began with the usual diplomatic pleasantries before his tone shifted almost imperceptibly. "Takes a great and paternal interest in the continuation of your Majesty's noble line. He understands you have been blessed with a fine, healthy heir." He paused, then added with a devastatingly casual air, "But he was also saddened to hear of the poor health of your firstborn. It is a sorrow we all share when a dynasty's future is so fragile." The words, though couched in sympathy, were a declaration of diplomatic war. The secret was out. It had not just leaked beyond the palace walls, it had crossed borders and reached the ears of a hostile government. The king, a master of political theater, offering a cool, non-committal reply about the privacy of his family's health. But according to the memoirs of the Secretary of State, who was present, a visible pallor spread across the king's face. The ambassador had not just revealed his knowledge, he had demonstrated the king's vulnerability. This information could be used to destabilize the kingdom, to support a rival claimant in a future succession crisis, or simply to undermine the king's authority in treaty negotiations. The reception ended, but the panic had just begun. An emergency session of the Privy Council was convened that very night. The atmosphere was no longer one of methodical planning, but of acute crisis management. The internal rumor and the ambassador's remark were clearly connected. The leak was worse than they had imagined. They were no longer in control of the secret. Every additional day the child remained in the palace was another day for the rumor to spread, for the story to solidify, for a foreign power to gather more details. The slow, careful plan for a winter transfer was now a luxury they could not afford. The risk was no longer theoretical and distant, it was immediate and existential. The king, his voice tight with controlled fury, made the final pronouncement. "This ends now," he commanded the council. "The transfer will be executed before the next full moon. I want the impediment removed and the source of this leak found and silenced. There will be no more delays." The debate was over. The timetable had been violently accelerated. The monastery option had transformed from a long-term strategy into an urgent, desperate gambit to be executed under extreme pressure. The emergency session of the Privy Council, convened in the wake of the ambassador's veiled threat, was not a deliberation. It was a final briefing for a military-style extraction. The king's command, "This ends now," had stripped away all remaining ambiguity. The atmosphere in the chamber was one of grim, focused intensity. The question was no longer what to do. but precisely how to execute the plan under a severely compressed timeline without error or detection. The theoretical monastery option now had to be rendered into a concrete, minute-by-minute operational schedule. The spymaster, a man accustomed to the logistics of clandestine movement, spoke first. He unrolled a series of hand-drawn maps on the great oak table, detailing a route that utilized forgotten service gates, old logging trails, and the cover of the royal forests. The journey to the remote charter house would take 3 nights. The key, he stressed, was to avoid all major roads, towns, and even small villages. The travel party would move only between dusk and dawn, resting during the day in pre-selected, secure locations: a loyal farmer's barn, a disused hunting lodge. The risk of chance encounters would be minimized to near zero. Next, the logistics of the conveyance itself were finalized. A plain, unmarked carriage, the same one noted by the stable hand's rumor, was to be used. Its wheels would be wrapped in thick cloth to muffle their sound on the palace cobblestones. The interior would be fitted with heavy, light-blocking curtains. The royal crests on the harnesses of the horses would be removed or covered. It was to be a ghost carriage, utterly anonymous. The escort would consist of only 4 men, drawn from the king's personal guard, veterans whose loyalty was absolute and whose silence was guaranteed by the knowledge that their own lives were forfeit should the mission fail. They would be commanded by a captain who reported directly, and only, to the king himself. The protocol for the final handover was determined with equal precision. The armed escort would not travel all the way to the charter house, which would attract unwanted attention. Instead, they would proceed to a designated rendezvous point, an ancient, crumbling stone bridge over a mountain stream, 5 leagues from the monastery. There, at the first light of the 4th day, they would be met by a single, elderly lay brother dispatched by the prior. No names would be exchanged, likely sedated with a mild opiate provided by Drive. Du Bois, to ensure its passivity, would be transferred to the care of the monk, who would complete the final leg of the journey on a simple mule cart. The captain would hand over a sealed purse of gold for the monastery's immediate needs and a letter from Bishop Ard. Then he and his men would turn back, their mission complete. With the external logistics settled, the council turned to the most delicate and dangerous part of the plan: the internal security risks, specifically the 2 primary witnesses, Elspeth and the nursemaid. They knew too much. Their continued presence at court, even under guard, was an unacceptable liability. The Lord Chancellor addressed the matter in cold, legalistic terms. Their service contracts were to be terminated, effective the night of the transfer. Their fates, however, would differ according to their station. The young nursemaid, being illiterate and of low birth, was deemed a simple problem. She would be awoken in the middle of the night, paid a sum of silver so large it would seem a fortune to her, and escorted by guards to the border of her home province with a single, terrifying, and unspoken warning: she would be too rich to complain and too frightened to ever speak of what she had seen. Elspeth was a more complex matter. She was a gentlewoman, literate, and possessed a deep, if forbidden, attachment to the child. She could not be threatened as crudely as a servant. A more elegant solution was required. The treasurer proposed that she be rewarded for her years of discreet service. She would be granted a generous royal pension and given the deed to a small, comfortable manor house. The property, however, was located in the same remote, mountainous region as the charter house, a beautiful, isolated prison where she would live out her days in comfortable exile, hundreds of miles from the court and any sympathetic ears. The offer would be presented as a gift, but its true nature as a sentence of permanent silence would be unmistakable. To refuse, it would be to sign her own death warrant. Finally, the council decided on the official narrative that would be disseminated within the palace to explain the sudden emptiness of the northern wing. The invalid ward, whose existence was known only to a handful of staff, would be said to have finally succumbed to its chronic ailments. A private, unrecorded burial had been conducted to spare the royal family further grief. The rooms would be stripped of their furnishings, locked, and eventually repurposed as an archive for state documents, the physical space of the child's life buried under the weight of official history. The decision was made. Every contingency had been addressed, every loose end accounted for. The king gave his final, curt nod of approval. The deliberation was over. The mechanism of immerse was fully designed and ready to be set in motion. The final deliberation of the Privy Council set in motion a chain of events that would unfold with the silent, ineluctable precision of a clockwork mechanism. The first gear to turn was the one that would sever the child's last and most significant human bond. 2 nights before the scheduled departure of the ghost carriage, the captain of the king's personal guard, the man tasked with overseeing the transfer, appeared at the door of the nursery's antechamber. He was accompanied by 2 guards and a stern-faced woman in the severe, dark dress of a court functionary. Elspeth was summoned from the main room. The captain, a man she had seen only from a distance, did not waste time on pleasantries. He unrolled a small parchment scroll bearing the king's seal and read a brief, formal proclamation. By order of the sovereign, her duties as governess to the royal ward were concluded, effective immediately. Her service was acknowledged, and her reward, the pension and the deed to the remote manor, was summarily explained to her by the female functionary. The tone was not one of gratitude, but of dismissal. It was a transaction, the final payment on a long and difficult contract. Elspeth stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. She had known in some deep, unspoken part of her mind that her role was temporary, that a final disposition of the child would one day come. But the sudden, brutal finality of this moment was a shock. She looked past the captain, trying to peer into the room where the child was sleeping, and a wave of protective instinct, honed over nearly a decade of secret care, surged through her. "The child," she began, her voice trembling. "They cannot be left at maids. The ward's care has been arranged." The captain cut her off, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. "Your presence is no longer required. You will gather your personal effects. You have 1 hour." Panic gave way to a desperate, hopeless plea. "Please," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the captain. "Let me say goodbye." The captain's expression hardened. "There will be no goodbyes. Your attachment has been noted as a potential complication. You will not re-enter that room." His words confirmed her greatest fear. Her secret affection had been observed and judged a liability. The 2 guards stepped forward slightly, their posture a clear, physical denial of her request. The full, horrific reality of the situation descended upon her. She was being cast out, and she would not be allowed even a final, silent gesture of farewell to the child who had been the sole focus of her life for so many years. The secret language they had built together, the rituals of comfort, the unspoken bond, all of it was to be severed with the clean, cruel efficiency of an executioner's axe. The functionary stepped forward and gently but firmly took Elspeth's arm, leading her to her small, adjacent bedchamber to pack her few belongings. While Elspeth was being processed out of the child's life, the young nursemaid was dealt with in a far more summary fashion. She was awoken from her cot by another guard, taken to a small office, and presented with a heavy purse of silver coins. She was told her family had requested her immediate return and that the king, in his generosity, had provided for her journey and her future. The girl, terrified and bewildered, was overwhelmed to ask questions. She was bundled into a cloak, led through service corridors to a waiting cart, and by dawn she was miles from the palace, a simple, loose thread neatly snipped and discarded. Elspeth's departure was more formal, a quiet and chilling procession. An hour later, carrying a single small trunk, she was escorted back through the antechamber. She averted her eyes from the door to the main nursery, a door that was now, for her, the most forbidden place in the world. As she was led down the long silent corridor, she could hear a faint, distressed cry from within the room. The child, likely awakened by the strange voices and the absence of her familiar presence. The sound was a physical torment, a final, unanswered call that would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. She was placed in a carriage, not the grand coach of a favored retiree, but a plain, functional transport, and began her long, lonely journey into exile. The severing was complete. The child was now in the hands of strangers, its last emotional anchor ripped away in cold, calculated preparation for the final journey into darkness. With Elspeth's removal, the child was left in the care of 2 anonymous guards, men chosen not for their nurturing abilities, but for their unquestioning obedience. For 48 hours, the familiar, predictable rhythm of the child's life was shattered. The gentle, known hands were replaced by the rough, efficient movements of soldiers. The soft, humming voice was replaced by a gruff silence. The child, unable to comprehend the change, existed in a state of heightened anxiety, its distress manifesting as a low, continuous whimper that the guards largely ignored. This period of destabilization was deliberate, a final disorientation before the ultimate dislocation. On the third night, under a sliver of a moon in the sky thick with clouds, the final phase of the operation began. An hour after midnight, when the palace was at its deepest slumber, the captain of the guard and his 4 hand-picked men arrived at the nursery. They carried with them a small, leather-wrapped vial, prepared by Dr. Du Bois. It contained a tincture of opium and wine, a sedative strong enough to ensure the child remained unconscious for the duration of the journey to the rendezvous point. The administration of the drug was the first act. The child, already agitated, resisted the unfamiliar taste of the liquid forced into its mouth, but its weak struggles were no match for the strength of the guards. Within minutes, its whimpering subsided, its limbs grew limp, and it fell into a deep, unnatural sleep. The captain then produced a large, coarse woolen blanket and a length of rope. The child was swaddled tightly, not in the manner of an infant, but in the manner of a piece of cargo being secured for transport. Its face was left uncovered to allow for breathing. But its body was entirely cocooned, its limbs immobilized. It was no longer a person, it was a parcel. The journey from the nursery to the waiting carriage was a route through the palace's hidden anatomy. Carrying the small, inert bundle, the men moved not through the grand corridors, but through a network of narrow, cold service passages. They descended a tight, spiral staircase once used by servants, their footsteps echoing softly in the stone shaft. They passed through the cavernous, silent kitchens, their boots silent on the flagstones. They emerged into a small, enclosed scullery yard, a space that smelled of damp earth and discarded vegetable matter. Here, parked in the deepest shadows, was the ghost carriage, its horses already harnessed and waiting, their hooves muffled in cloth. The bundled child was passed into the carriage and placed on the floor, wedged between the seats with heavy cushions to prevent it from rolling. One of the guards climbed in beside it, his orders to monitor its breathing and ensure it remains himself, with the other 3 guards mounted on horseback, their swords sheathed, their faces grim. With a barely audible click of the harnesses, the carriage lurched forward, its cloth-wrapped wheels making only a soft, brushing sound on the gravel of the service road. They exited the palace grounds not through the main gates, but through a small, remote postern gate, used for garden supplies, a gate for which the captain carried the only key. As the gate closed behind them, they were absorbed into the deep, rural darkness beyond the city's glow. The sensory experience of the journey was one of profound and deliberate negation. The child, in its drugged sleep, perceived nothing. For the men, the world was reduced to the rhythmic creak of the carriage's leather suspension, the soft thud of hooves on the dirt track, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. They navigated by starlight and memory, following the route laid out by the spymaster. They forded shallow streams to avoid bridges, cut through open fields to skirt sleeping villages, and plunged into the dense, disorienting darkness of the royal forests. The mounted guards rode ahead and behind, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of a traveler, a poacher, or a night watchman. The entire operation was a moving bubble of silence and secrecy, its sole purpose to transport a single sleeping child from the heart of the kingdom to its absolute periphery without leaving a single trace or creating a single witness. The palace, which had been the child's entire world, its gilded prison, had been left behind. It was now unmoored, a piece of living contraband being smuggled out of its own history. The journey concluded as it had begun, in darkness and silence. On the dawn of the 4th day, the ghost carriage reached the designated rendezvous point, the ancient stone bridge spanning a fast-flowing mountain river. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp rock. The world was a monochrome palette of grey stone, dark water, and the pale, misty light of early morning. Here, the captain called a halt. As prophesied by the spymaster's plan, A figure was waiting on the far side of the bridge, alone. Elderly man in the simple, undyed wool habit of a lay brother, holding the reins of a sturdy mule hitched to a small two-wheeled cart. The exchange was silent and swift. There were no greetings, no questions. The guard from inside the carriage emerged, carrying the still sedated, blanket-wrapped child. He passed the bundle to the waiting monk, a simple transfer of weight from the custody of the state to the custody of the church. The captain dismounted and handed the lay brother the sealed person the letter for the prior. The monk gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, placed the child carefully into the bed of his cart, and covered it with a rough-spun wool blanket. Without a backward glance, he clucked to his mule and began the slow, arduous journey up the steep, winding track that led away from the river and deeper into the mountains. The king's men watched until the cart disappeared around a bend, then turned their horses and began their rapid journey back to the capital. The final destination, the Charterhouse, was not a place one stumbled upon by accident. It was a statement of intent, a deliberate act of architectural isolation. After several more hours of climbing, the track opened onto a high windswept plateau. Here, nestled against the sheer rock face of a mountain, stood the monastery. It was less a house of God and more a fortress against the world. It was constructed not of elegant limestone but of rough-hewn, local granite, its color the same somber gray as the surrounding peaks. A high, thick wall, devoid of any ornamentation, enclosed the entire compound. There was a single, massive oak gate, reinforced with iron, which was the only point of entry. The architecture within the walls was brutally minimalist and profoundly functional. There was no grand cloister, no soaring nave. A small, unadorned chapel stood at the center, its stone top barely rising above the height of the outer wall, containing a single bell whose toll was the only sound that regularly broke the silence. Radiating from this central point were the simple, identical stone cottages or cells of the monks, each with its own small, walled garden for contemplation and subsistence farming. The entire design spoke of self-sufficiency, of a radical and permanent severing of ties with the outside world. The child's new home was one of these cottages, located at the farthest, most isolated corner of the compound. It was a space of monastic austerity, the polar opposite of its first, gilded prison. There were two small rooms. The main room contained a simple wooden bed with a straw-filled mattress and a woolen bed with a straw-filled mattress and a woolen blanket, a small table, the single chair, and a stone hearth for warmth. Imperfect glassing looked out not onto a palace wall, but onto the monastery's burial ground, a field of simple unmarked wooden crosses. This was a space designed for the contemplation of mortality, not for the nurturing of life. The care provided here was of a completely different nature than that of Elspeth's. The two monks assigned to the child were old men, chosen for their physical strength and their placid, incurious piety. They attended to the child's needs as they would any other of their sacred duties, with methodical, dispassionate routine. They brought food, they stoked the fire, they performed the necessary ablutions. But there was no touch of comfort, no soothing hum, no attempt to form a bond. They operated in near total silence, as their order demanded. They were not cruel, they were simply detached, their minds focused on the liturgy of the hours and the salvation of their own souls. The child was another of their chores, a living opportunity to practice the virtue of selfless service, but it was an object of that service, not a partner in a relationship. This was the true architecture of forgetting. It was a system designed to strip away identity and absorb all life into its silent, unchanging rhythm. The child had been moved from a place where its name was a forbidden secret to a place where names were irrelevant. It had been transferred from the care of a conflicted, loving guardian to that of indifferent, pious functionaries. The complex sensory inputs of the palace were gone, replaced by the elemental realities of stone, wind, and the tolling of the bell. It was an ontological shift. In the palace, the child had been a secret, a known thing that was hidden. Here, it was becoming a non-entity, a life that would leave no mark, its existence dissolving into the vast, anonymous silence of the mountains and the church. The child's arrival at the Charterhouse marked its final and complete disappearance from the verifiable historical record. From this point forward, Its existence enters a realm of shadow, a space where the narrative must be reconstructed from inference, from the logic of the environment, and from the profound and telling silence that follows. There are no more secret folios from physicians, no minutes from privy councils, no first-hand accounts. The state had successfully transported its secret to a place designed to extinguish history. The child's final years were, by design, unrecorded. Life in the monastic cottage was a stark, unchanging routine. The days were measured not by clocks, but by the 7 canonical hours tolled by the chapel bell, from matins before dawn to compline after dusk. These bells were the only punctuation in a life of otherwise monotonous sensory input. The child's world was now reduced to the 4 stone walls of its cell, the small, enclosed garden where it was occasionally taken for air, and the faces of the 2 elderly monks who provided its care. This existence was a far purer form of isolation than the palace nursery had ever been. There at least were the faint, ghostly sounds of a vibrant world beyond the walls. Here there was only the wind, the chime of the bell, and the profound, enveloping silence of the mountains. The child's physical and mental state in this new environment can only be speculated upon. It is likely that the initial period was one of extreme distress and confusion. The sudden total absence of the familiar, the face of Elspeth, the texture of its bedding, the specific quality of the light in its old room, would have been a severe psychological shock. This trauma, layered upon its inherent cognitive and developmental challenges, probably resulted in a period of regression, a retreat even further into the silent prison of its own mind. As the months turned into years, a kind of adaptation would have occurred. The child would have learned the new rhythms of its life, the arrival of the morning meal after the first bell, the stoking of the fire as darkness fell. But this was an adaptation of a captive animal, not the developmental progress of a human being. Without any form of stimulation, without the complex, non-verbal language it had shared with Elspeth, without any emotional reciprocity whatsoever, its cognitive development would have effectively ceased. It would have existed in a perpetual, timeless present, its mind a still pond reflecting only the immediate sensations of warmth, cold, hunger, and fullness. The physical decline likely paralleled the mental one. The child's congenital condition came with a host of potential secondary health issues, respiratory weaknesses, cardiac vulnerabilities. The care provided by the monks, while diligent, would have been rudimentary. They were not nurses or physicians. They would have provided warmth, food, and basic hygiene, but they would have been unequipped to deal with a serious illness. A common cold could easily have progressed to a fatal pneumonia in the damp, cold mountain air. Any one of a dozen minor ailments, manageable in a different context, could have proven fatal here. The most probable scenario is that the child's life was not a long one, deprived of the will to live that comes from human connection, and with a body that was already medically fragile, it would have been highly susceptible to illness and despair. Its death, when it came, would have been as quiet and unrecorded as its life. It would have occurred one morning when one of the monks arrived with the breakfast tray to find the small bed still and the child no longer breathing. There would have been no ceremony. The prior, informed by the monk, would have said a silent prayer for the anonymous innocent who had been in their charge. The body would have been wrapped in a simple linen shroud. It would have been carried to the small cemetery outside, its window, and buried in a freshly dug, unmarked grave. Another plain wooden cross would be hammered into the earth, indistinguishable from all the others. No name would be chiseled, no date recorded in any parish register. The two monks would return to their cells, their sacred duty concluded. The prior would continue his prayers. The chapel bell would continue to toll the hours. The life would have ended, leaving no ripple, no echo, nothing but a small mound of earth in a forgotten graveyard on a remote plateau. The child had not just died, it had been successfully and completely erased from the book of life. The child's unrecorded death in the mountain charter house marked the end of its biological existence, but it did not immediately terminate its administrative ghost. A secret of this magnitude, sustained for over a decade by the machinery of the state, could not simply vanish. It had to be formally and methodically dismantled. The final act of the child's Urasua was not performed with a prayer or a eulogy, but with the dry, precise stroke of a clerk's quill in a royal account book. The proof of the child's life and the proof of its end is found not in Chronicles, but in the cold, impartial logic of household finance. Sometime in the late autumn, a full season after the child's likely demise, a lone, travel-stained messenger arrived at the palace. He was a lay brother from the Charterhouse, and he carried a single, sealed letter for Bishop Laud. The letter's contents would have been brief and heavily coded. It would not have mentioned a death or a child. It would have stated simply that the pious charge, which the crown had entrusted to their care, had been called to its eternal reward, and that their prayers for the royal family's spiritual well-being were unceasing. The message was an invoice for a soul, a notification that a long-term contract of care had been concluded by an act of God. Bishop Laud would have read the letter, burned it to ash in the privacy of his chambers, and then sought a private audience with the king. The news would have been delivered in a low, solemn whisper. The king's reaction would not have been one of grief, but of profound, final relief. A great and terrible weight, a secret he had carried for the entirety of his second son's life, had finally been lifted. The dynastic threat was over. The constitutional paradox was resolved. The flaw in his bloodline had been corrected by divine providence. His next action was purely administrative. He summoned his Lord Treasurer, a man who, as a member of the Privy Council, was one of the few who understood the true nature of a specific, recurring disbursement from the king's private funds. The order given was simple. The stipend for the charge of St. Jerome in the mountains is no longer required. See the account closed. This entry had appeared without fail 4 times a year since the child's transfer. The amount was substantial but not extravagant, enough to support the small monastery and ensure its continued loyalty and discretion. The payments were made not by royal draft, which could be traced, but by a discreet transfer of gold bullion, delivered by a trusted agent. It was an auditable trail that led nowhere, a recurring expense whose true purpose was known only to the treasurer and his sovereign. Repeating line item was the only tangible, official proof that the child had continued to exist after its removal from the palace. Following the king's order, the Lord Treasurer would have performed the final ritual. He would have opened the great ledger to the relevant page. He would have located the entry for the street. Then, taking a fresh quill, he would have made the final notation. He would not have written deceased or terminated. The language of accounting is impersonal. He would have simply drawn a single, neat, diagonal line through the last payment entry. He would have written the date and a single Latin word, finis, the end. With that stroke of ink, the child was officially, financially, and historically gone. The ongoing operational cost of its existence had ceased, and therefore, in the eyes of the state's accounting, so had the existence itself. The great ledger was closed, its clasp secured, and it was returned to its place in the royal archives, a massive, silent tomb of data. The evidence of the child's life was not destroyed. It was simply buried, hidden in plain sight amidst tens of thousands of other, mundane financial transactions. It became a secret that no longer needed to be kept because there was no one left alive who knew how to read the code. The treasurer knew, but he was a man who would take 1,000 such secrets to his grave. This was the final, posthumous act of erasure, accomplished not with a shovel, but with a quill. The child's life, which began as a dynastic crisis and ended as a solitary death, was ultimately reduced to a balanced book, a closed account. Its value, its cost, and its final disposition were all recorded in the dispassionate arithmetic of power. The closure of the secret account in the royal ledgers marked the final act of a meticulously executed state policy of erasure. The child was now gone in body, in memory, and in administrative fact. The success of this policy is measured not by what was written, but by what was not. Its most profound and lasting legacy is a deliberate and conspicuous void in the official historical record. The final chapter of this story is found in the silence of the archives. Subsequent official histories of the king's reign, commissioned by the crown and written by court historians, are uniform in their account of the royal succession. They record the tragic, noble grief of the king and queen at the birth of their stillborn first child. They then celebrate, with soaring rhetoric, the subsequent birth of the healthy second son, portraying his arrival as a divine gift, a sign of God's favor upon the kingdom, a blessed answer to the nation's prayers. The second son is not the spare, he is and always was the sole undisputed heir. The narrative is seamless, a perfectly constructed fiction that served the state's needs. The inconvenient firstborn is not even a footnote, it is a ghost that was never permitted to be born. The genealogical records, the great sprawling family trees of the dynasty meticulously painted on vellum scrolls, are similarly doctored. The line of descent from the king flows directly and unbroken to his second son. There is no empty branch, no sign of a name having been scraped away or painted over. The space where the first child's name should be is simply not there. The error sewer is so complete that it is invisible. It is a lie told by omission, a form of historical falsification that is almost impossible to detect without prior knowledge of what one is looking for. The members of the Privy Council, the architects of the error sewer, carried the secret to their graves. Their letters, memoirs, and personal papers contain no hint of the affair. They were men who understood that some state secrets were too foundational to ever be committed to paper. Their silence was absolute, a final act of loyalty to the crown they served. Dr. Du Bois's private folio, the only detailed, objective account of the child's early years, was not discovered until centuries later. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of a provincial library, its significance not understood until it was cross-referenced with other, more obscure documents. Even the physical spaces associated with the child's life were systematically cleansed of its memory. The suite of rooms in the palace's north wing was, as planned, stripped of its opulent furnishings. The cradle, the tapestries, the heavy curtains, all were removed and either destroyed or repurposed elsewhere. The rooms were sealed for a generation, and then, as intended, converted into a dusty, little-used archive. The velvet prison was paved over with layers of official paper, its history buried under the bureaucratic weight of the state. The success of the error sewer was, for a time, absolute. The king's second son grew up with no knowledge of his older sibling, ascended to the throne without challenge, and ruled for many decades. The dynasty continued, stable and secure. The secret, it seemed, had died with the child, but secrets, especially those of such magnitude, have a strange persistence. They leave behind faint traces, subtle inconsistencies that nag at future generations of historians. A discrepancy in the Queen's household accounts for a particular year. A cryptic, coded reference in a physician's letter to his brother. The persistent, low-level folkloric tale among the descendants of palace staff about a hidden child. These are the faint, spectral echoes of a life deliberately silenced. They are the threads that, when patiently pulled, begin to unravel the smooth tapestry of the official narrative. The silence in the archives is not an empty silence. It is a resonant one, heavy with the weight of what has been removed. The child, who was denied a name, a title, and a life, ultimately achieved a strange and anonymous form of immortality. It exists as a question mark in the margins of history, a permanent and unsettling to the brutal, impersonal calculus of power and the profound lengths to which a dynasty will go to protect itself from the perceived stain of imperfection. The most complete record of the child's life is the hole it left behind, a carefully carved void in the memory of a nation. The records, such as they are now closed. The official histories are written, and the unmarked grave on the mountainside has long since been reclaimed by the earth. We are left only with the silence, a silence that was the objective from the very beginning. It was a silence meticulously constructed from stone walls, from royal decrees, from fear, and from forgetting. But as you prepare for your own quiet stillness, consider the nature of that silence. Was it the sound of a problem being solved, of a kingdom being secured, of order triumphing over the chaos of a biological accident? Or was it the sound of a profound and terrible loneliness? The silence of a child who never heard its own name spoken with love. The silence of a governess exiled with her forbidden grief. The silence of men in a council chamber, convincing themselves of the necessity of a merciless act. The story is over, but the weaknesses it exposed, fear of the unknown, the worship of perfection, the cold logic of power that can dehumanize the vulnerable, are not historical artifacts. They are part of us. They are the quiet, insistent whispers in our own world, in our own time. A final thought before you sleep. Thus concludes the article.